webinar for this afternoon, and I have an image that shows quite a few pictures of the sort of the dichotomy that's taken place across the north central region. And when I say that, from Montana all the way over to Ohio and then south through Kentucky and westward to Colorado. We've had a lot of things going on weather-wise and quite a few impacts across the region. And on the left, it's almost like a fire and ice scenario where we've had some wildfires just over the past few days that have broken out across Colorado and Kansas. And the one in El Paso County actually was just a couple days ago. It was along I-25 south of Colorado Springs, and many acres of burning occurred, and unfortunately there was quite a bit of damage reported along the ways. And then just below and to the right of that is a burn scar from those wildfires, and then right above that is a fire that occurred in southwestern Kansas in Morton County, and of course much of southern Colorado and Kansas is experiencing some severe to extreme, even exceptional drought conditions, and these are sort of the things that you can get when you have drought conditions of that nature. Now, looking to the right, the snow and icy pictures are some of the things that we just saw last weekend and last Friday and into the weekend. We had a major blizzard, an unusual April spring blizzard impacting all the way from northeast Colorado through Nebraska, South Dakota, parts of Iowa, Minnesota, into Wisconsin and Michigan. A historic blizzard that dropped a lot of snowfall, quite a bit of a stripe of a foot or more of snow from those locations I just mentioned, and of course, many impacts from that blizzard event. And I guess a blessing in disguise, where there were some areas that needed some water in regard to dryness, and there was quite a bit of snow water equivalent associated with that blizzard, and anywhere from 1 to perhaps as much as 3 inches snow water equivalent. And so that helped mitigate some dry conditions across parts of that corridor. Unfortunately, of course, there was also quite a bit of negative impacts. Livestock took a pretty big hit in regard to the calving season across parts of the plains, and power outages and transportation issues. So again, impacts over the past 30 days. And we'll get into the conversation more, looking at more detail. But first, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping to talk a little bit about the climate services. Some areas providing climate services to the central region include the USDA Climate Hubs, the American Association of State Climatologists, the regional climate centers in the Midwest and High Plains, NOAA, NCI, as well as the National Drought Mitigation Center. The next Drought Outlook webinar will take place next month on the 17th. Dr. Dennis Toddy from the USDA Midwest Climate Hub will be facilitating that webinar. And then, of course, there's an archive of these for information on future webinars, as well as an archive of webinars that go back quite a few years, and those links are provided there. On the agenda for today, we'll first talk about January through March, temperature and precipitation conditions. We'll do a March recap. We'll talk a little bit about April. We'll go into the snow water issues, agriculture, of course, with the growing season just beginning to get going, and look at state impacts, climate outlooks, and at the end of the discussion, we'll entertain questions and comments. First of all, a January through March recap. This shows the statewide average temperature ranks from January through the end of March. The contiguous U.S. was about 1.6 degrees above the 20th century average, and it was our coldest start to the year in 4 years, so since 2014. You can see from January to March, temperatures for the most part have averaged above normal across much of the western U.S., most notably across the Southwest in Arizona and New Mexico. The southern U.S. has also been fairly mild. Parts of New England, most notably up in Maine. The upper Midwest, Michigan, has been somewhat warm, but a little bit of a cooler trend from January through March, most notably in Montana, but then going eastward and southeastward to cover much of the Midwest, much of the north central region for that matter, and on into the East Coast around some of the mid-Atlantic states. For precipitation, the greens are indicative of above normal precipitation. For the U.S. as a whole, the contiguous U.S., January through March precipitation total was about 7.3 inches, or slightly above average. So for the most part near normal. The green indicates the above normal precipitation for the 3-month period, of course, from Montana through the Dakotas, on southeastward into much of the Midwest. Very wet conditions in Indiana, Arkansas, Missouri. I know Missouri, we had our wettest February on record. Drier conditions in the Four Corner states, Kansas, on into parts of the western U.S. and the southeast. So what about March? These are the statewide temperature ranks for the month of March, last month. They generally, for the whole U.S., they averaged about 1.1 degrees above normal, which is near the median value for the period of record. Warmer than average from the central Rockies to the southwest and southern plains, and parts of the New England and upper Midwest were also above normal last month. Cooler than average conditions were along parts of the East Coast and northern high plains, as well as the West. For precipitation during the month of March, wetter conditions across the northern plains, most notably much above average conditions in North Dakota. Let's see, above average also across parts of the West, the northern Rockies, the Midwest, and the South. Below average precipitation across parts of the Northwest, southwestern U.S., Great Lakes, the Southeast and East Coast. There was a little bit of a boost in the snowpack across the Sierra Nevada, the northern Rockies, and the northern plains. Unfortunately, low snowpack had persisted in the southern Rockies, the central plains, and the Great Lakes. So let's go into April. We've had a lot of things, interesting climate scenarios taking place so far for the month of April. And I think this image really sort of kind of highlights or details just how unusually cold it has been across the north central U.S. It looks like when you look from April 1st through April 18th, the states that are in those various shades of blues, that's anywhere from running 9 to 10 degrees below normal to more than almost approaching 20 degrees below normal for an 18-day period, which is incredible. Anytime you have a double-digit departure from normal during this time of year over an 18-day period in that particular month, you're talking, it's likely a record. And indeed, that's what we're seeing. We are seeing this is for many states extending from North Dakota, South Dakota into Nebraska, parts of Kansas, northern Missouri, northern Illinois, into Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin. It is unprecedented in regard to how cold this April through April 18th period has been. When you go south and west of that area, actually temperatures sort of, they moderate quite a bit. In fact, Colorado, further south and west, the temperatures for the first 18 days of April have been anywhere from pretty much near to above average. But again, it's a very unusual condition we've seen so far this month across much of the north central states. I want to provide a little bit of perspective, and that's with this next image. I went back and looked through some of the cold April through 18th periods, looking back through all the way back to 1895. So that's 124 years of record. And I pulled out some of the coldest ones of record. And so I did a chronology. They're in chronological order. So in the top left is 1907. Which actually turns out that is Missouri's coldest April on record. It actually continued to be cold during that, and that's our coldest, as of now, that's our coldest April on record in 1907. 1920, 1926, 1975, 1983, 1997, 2007, 2013, and in the bottom right, that's this year. And you can see that nothing really beats the magnitude or intensity of this cold that we've seen during the first 18 days of the month. So we are on pace for currently for having the coldest April on record. Highly unusual. Just to provide context, Missouri has not broken an all-time cold monthly temperature record in almost 35 years. You have to go all the way back to December of 1983. That's the last time we broke a cold monthly temperature record. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 12 days. It turns out the current record for the north central U.S. Is April of 1920. So that's why I highlighted that in blue at the center top. That is, by the end of the month of April in 1920, the entire north central region was about 7 degrees below normal. So something to keep an eye on. It's interesting to note 2007 on the bottom left. That sort of rings a bell, especially when it comes to agriculture and horticulture, because we had the Easter freeze during the first week of April of 2007 that did a lot of damage to vegetation. The big difference between 2007 and 2018 was we had an unusually warm March, especially the latter 3 weeks of March, some unprecedented warmth impacting much of the north central area, all the way from the Central Plains to North Carolina. And unfortunately, that cold wave outbreak during the first week of April 2007 did a lot of damage to vegetation because that warm March condition had spurred vegetative growth, and we saw a lot of damage. That's not been the case this year because we really did not have the warmth of the magnitude this year like we did back in 2007. So that is a good thing in that regard because things have been very cold this month, unprecedented when we look back through history, and that image indicates that. Of course, with these cold conditions over almost the past 3 weeks, we've seen a lot of records fall. These are temperature records across the Midwest during the month of April. It looks like just about every official weather station broke some kind of record during the month. The black squares indicate minimum temperature records and maximum in regard to low maximum temperature records. And you can see a lot of squares and triangles indicating all the records that have been established during this cold first 18 days of April so far. Precipitation. So there's a little bit of variability going on across the north central region. Some very wet conditions across Montana, western Montana, northwest Wyoming, and that little blue stripe that you see from Colorado extending on into Nebraska, South Dakota, southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, on into Wisconsin and Michigan. A lot of that is associated with that blizzard that dropped all that snow that had a pretty good high snow water content, and so we see an above normal period from April 1st to the 18th, mostly due to that notable blizzard that was experienced last weekend. And of course, then there was another snow event over parts of northern Iowa, southern Minnesota, and southern Wisconsin yesterday, anywhere from I think it was 4 to as much as 10 inches of snow on top of what has been ongoing across Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin so far this month. A lot of snowfall records have fallen because of the cold conditions. Drier conditions to the north, across especially in North Dakota, parts of northern Minnesota, and then unfortunately, the intensity just continues of dryness across southern Colorado into much of Kansas. We've been very dry here in Missouri. Some locations across northern and western Missouri have seen less than a half inch of precipitation so far this month, so things are drying up again. Wetter conditions as you go eastward across portions of southeast Missouri, southern Illinois, and very wet conditions along the Ohio River Valley, extending all the way from Indiana, Kentucky, and up into the mid-Atlantic states. And then, of course, very wet conditions across the northern part of lower Michigan this month. So let's look at some of the snow water information. This is a map that came out yesterday, so it does not include the snow event that occurred yesterday, and we still see some residual from that blizzard of some high snow water content across parts of south central, southeast South Dakota, on into southern Minnesota, quite a bit of northern Wisconsin, the UP of Michigan. Looks like a little strap of snow from Bismarck to Fargo of high water content, anywhere it looks like from 1 to as much as 2, maybe 3 inches of snow water equivalent. So there's still a pretty good blanket of snow impacting the upper Midwest, parts of the northern plains, which is pretty unusual considering we're well into April. Snowfall records, of course. We've had here in Missouri. We've had 3 or 4 snowfall events during April, which is highly unusual. And we've seen any more as you go north into Iowa and up into much of the Midwest. These are daily snowfall records that have been broken or tied during the month of April. Just about every weather station in the region has experienced 1 or more snowfall records this month. It for many locations, it will go down in the records books as the snowiest April on record. So, cold and snowy has been the theme so far for this April, especially across the upper Midwest. As we go westward and look at the snow water equivalent on what's taken place along the watersheds of the Intermountain region, we see watersheds, and the blues and the greens are indicative of a decent snowpack, and so the watersheds in the northern Rockies and North Cascades are all indicative of excess of 100% or of snow or higher of snow water equivalent. As unfortunately, as you work your way southward and westward, conditions deteriorate quite rapidly, where we see less than 50% of snow water equivalent for much of the Great Basin, the Colorado Plateau, the southern Rockies. It's when you see some zeros in parts of some of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in northern New Mexico, parts of the White Mountains, the San Francisco Peaks in Arizona, the San Juans in southwestern Colorado. They've been running some very low snowfall for this year, unfortunately. When we look at the Missouri River Basin, the mountain snowpack water content, the image on the right is from Montana, the total above Fort Peck. You can see the blue is indicative of this year, the inches of water equivalent, and take it all the way up to the top through about the middle part of April. It's running about 140% of average compared to the April 15th peak, and it looks so that's quite notable. Of all the snowpack they've seen up in Montana, some decent snow water equivalent, running 140% of average. On the right, as you go further east, from Fort Peck to Garrison, again, the blue line is above normal. It's running about 139% of average from the 415 peak is when we typically expect. Looking at the Platte River Basin, so going southward, the total North Platte, which is much of parts of Colorado, much of southeastern Wyoming. On the left, conditions not as robust as we saw up north. The blue line is indicative of when it peaked just a few days earlier than normal. Typically, the peak is right around April 15th, and it was just slightly below the average at 93% of average. Total South Platte, which is a good chunk of the northeastern quarter or so of Colorado, a little bit lower conditions when we look at the current. It's running about 86% of average. It looked like it was going to peak earlier in April, but we got a little bit of a bump, perhaps from that blizzard that drove it up to now. It's going upward a little bit as of April 16th, but it's considered, and it typically peaks a little bit later towards the end of April, and so it's about 86% of average. And there is another system forecast, hopefully maybe to impact Colorado over the next few days, that might bring some more snow to the region. When we look at 7-day average stream flow, the blues and the various shades of blues and even black are indicative of above to much above normal to even record high. stream flows, the average 7-day stream flow, but generally normal to much above average stream flows are impacting the northern Rockies. It looks like into the Pacific Northwest, the Cascades, the Olympics. Above normal across some of the northern Great Plains, northern Iowa, where they've seen quite a bit of precip, mostly in the form of snow. Southern Minnesota, southern Michigan, and the Ohio River Valley, where it's been fairly wet. We see below to much below normal stream flows impacting southwestern Colorado, much of Kansas, northern Missouri, and on into the UP of Michigan, the Arrowhead of Minnesota. And there are some ongoing record stream flows, those black dots that you see across Montana, where some flooding is occurring. This is the outlook, the significant river flood outlook from yesterday. Sort of focus perhaps on the occurring or imminent flooding condition that's taking place up in north central Montana, a little bit around, it looks like Sioux Falls, South Dakota area, eastern South Dakota, or significant river flooding is likely. And want to show you, this is an image of the Missouri Basin that indicates some already major flooding in the upper left across north central Montana, the Milk River Basin. And it looks like this flooding is going to continue as temperatures warm and the snowmelt continues. Other conditions along the Missouri River Basin above Fort Tech, it looks like indications of minor crest at Big Hole, Dearborn, and Jefferson in late May. And then upper right, the Yellowstone River Basin, where the arrow indicates along the wind, minor crest in early June and minor crest early June on the yellow at Livingston. The James River Basin, minor to moderate beginning, that's running from eastern North Dakota into eastern South Dakota. Minor to moderate beginning perhaps is next week. And then the Big Little Sioux River Basins, where snowmelt is minor to moderate and flooding is already occurring and is projected in the near term. And of course, then perhaps some minor to moderate flooding along some of the tributaries in East Kansas and Missouri, mostly due to the thunderstorms, increasing likelihood of thunderstorm activity as we go into May, which is for Missouri is our wettest month on record, or typically our wettest month. These are the Great Lakes, looking at the ice cover. This came from yesterday, and there's still a little bit of ice out there. It's running a little bit later than usual. Of course, that's not surprising considering how cold April has been, but nonetheless, only about 5.7% of the Great Lakes are in ice. It looks like, and those shades of grays and blacks are indicative of the ice concentration, and looks like Lake Superior, and then right around Lake Michigan, around the Door Peninsula, we see some, and then over in Canada and Lake Huron, we see where this small percentage of ice is concentrated. Agriculture, we are in the growing season, especially across the southern part of the central region, and of course, drought is always on everybody's mind in regard to growing season, because agriculture is definitely impacted by drought. But unfortunately, we see some very dry conditions across much of Colorado. The most intense drought, exceptional drought, that was just introduced this week in southwestern Colorado, and then extends eastward into Kansas, southern Kansas, and a little bit of D4 exceptional drought. There was a picture I had shown at the beginning from Morton County, Kansas. That's southwest Kansas, and Elkhart, Kansas is in Morton County, but that's where one of the fires were located. And that's when you have exceptional drought conditions, and these have been droughty conditions that have been going on for several months now. There's always that possibility of fire, and unfortunately, that's what we've been seeing. And there's many other impacts as well. due to this dryness. Agricultural impacts, I'll talk a little bit about that more in one of the other maps, but that dryness extends, droughty conditions, severe to exceptional drought extends into much of Kansas, parts of northwest, western Missouri, southern Iowa. As you go north into the northeast Montana, parts of North Dakota, and South Dakota. I should mention there actually has been some improvement, especially in parts of central and western South Dakota with these recent precipitation events. It's still a little dry in North Dakota, but that's somewhat of a long-term residual carryover of the historic drought that was ongoing last year in the Dakotas and parts of Montana. But overall, I think what to keep an eye on is what's going on from Colorado through Kansas, and even perhaps into parts of Missouri where things are still quite dry. These are the soil temperatures from the week of April 8th to the 14th. And of course, when you have unprecedented cold Aprils, that's reflected in the ground as well. And so we see these really cold soil temperatures for April. I was looking at mid-Missouri where for that week of April 8th to the 14th, where they're in the low 40s. That's more typical during the second week of March to see foreign soil temperatures in the low 40s. So that really kind of puts into perspective. That's 4 weeks behind. I mean, we're experiencing second week of March soil temperatures here in the second week of April, and of course those cold temperatures extend well and up into the North Dakota. We still have quite a bit of frost line that exists across the Dakotas into Minnesota, parts of Iowa, Wisconsin. We still have some frozen ground, which then of course has made it prohibitive for any type of planting like spring wheat. And so very unusual conditions in regard to soil temperatures and how cool they've been so far this month. These are the top soil moisture maps from National Ag Statistics Service, indicating on the left anything in the various shades of brown. The darker shades are what to draw your eye to, because that is indicative of just how dry things are. We talked about all the dryness ongoing in Kansas and Colorado, and that extends into parts of Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. And you can see just how the numbers do not look good in regard to the percentage of those states that are showing short to very short topsoil moisture conditions. On the right, more the blues are indicative of surpluses or some wet soils, and of course that makes sense with some of the precipitation events that have been ongoing across Montana on into parts of the upper Midwest, and then the Ohio River Valley, where we see some of the highest surplus topsoil moisture conditions. Corn progress. It's not a lot happening. We just haven't had the weather, the mild weather to warm those soil temperatures up for corn planting, and so pretty much non-existent all the way from the Minnesota through South Dakota, Nebraska, only 1%, but the brackets indicate how far below the percentage points below normal. And Missouri running the biggest deficit when it comes to being behind in corn planting. Maybe a little bit in the southwest Missouri, a little bit in the Boot Heel, but as far as I know, I don't think there's been any, if all, planting going on pretty much the northern half of the state. And that's, you can say that for much of Illinois, of course, much of Iowa. It's just not happening because of this very cold period we've had over the past few weeks. Spring wheat progress, again, those cold conditions have made it virtually impossible to get for any spring wheat planting. And South Dakota is testimony to that, running 33 percentage points behind compared to what is this year with 1% of the spring wheat planted. So again, the cold weather and frozen soils have made that prohibitive across that area. The oats progress, again, similarly with the crops and the cold weather, just things are running behind. Looks like most notably in South Dakota and Iowa, running more than 30 percentage points behind normal. And then probably the wetness and cold weather that we're seeing in Ohio, that's running behind as well. And then, of course, with little planted, not much has emerged as well, as noted on the right side of the image. Sugar beets, again, nothing. North Dakota and Minnesota running 12 to 18 points behind, respectively. Cold weather has, frozen ground has made that run behind. I talked a little bit of, a lot of the climatic factors we've been seeing over the past few weeks. And of course, these are some of the impacts that we've seen. I want to thank everyone who provided all this great information on what their states have been experiencing. And the best way for me to sort of share with you on what's happening across much of the north central region is to take that information and put it in the respective boundaries, and knowing that the impacts are not confined to each state. They obviously can cross over into other states. And I think the recurring theme that you'll see when you read through some of these states is just how cold it's been. And coldest April on record so far as we go through the first 18 days of the month of April. And that's going, again, from North and South Dakota on into parts of Nebraska, Kansas, northern Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, into the northern parts of Illinois. Some just very cold conditions. And of course, accordingly with the cold, we see plant progression. Vegetative growth is running several weeks behind normal with these cold conditions. There has been not near amount the freeze damage that we saw in 2007 because of the cold conditions, fairly cool conditions we saw in March that really did not spur any vegetative growth that could have made it vulnerable to freezing. And then, of course, the droughty conditions that we're seeing across parts of Colorado, some of the impacts we're seeing where dry ponds, there are lots of hauling water, major wildfires, of course, occurring, and some locations in southwest Colorado are having their driest water year to date. And so that begins October 1. So we're talking over more than a 6-month period. For example, Cortez, Colorado, it's the driest water year to date on record. So just a bleak situation ongoing in parts of southern Colorado with the drought, and then that carries over on into Kansas, where we're seeing some dry, especially southwestern parts of Kansas. So, and then a little bit on the east, you can see some of the wetter conditions and even some minor flooding that's ongoing along the Ohio River Valley that still is delaying planting across the southeastern part of the north central region. And then, of course, snowmelt is beginning in Montana, and we're starting to see some widespread flooding, aerial flooding across north central Montana, especially along the Milk River and Big Sandy Creek. And so to keep an eye on the situation there, since any warm up could melt the snow faster and the forecast could change because of that situation. So let's look at some of the climate outlooks. 7-day precipitation forecast. This is an amount. On the left, you can see the legend that indicates how much is anticipated or forecasted over the next 7 days. I should say over the next few days, that precipitation forecast you see in much of Colorado and up into South Dakota, down to Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma is a system that is forecast just over the next 1 to 3 days impact that area. So really hoping that that's one that verifies, because that area needs the rain the worst when it comes to this dryness and this drought that we're seeing. So it looks like perhaps some decent snowfall totals, hopefully over southwest Colorado. We can see some big snows. That system is going to slide a little bit to the south and east. It looks like it's going to miss mostly Iowa and Missouri and on into Illinois, and bring the heavier precip totals into Oklahoma, Arkansas, and down into the southeastern U.S. Later on the periods like days 4 and 5, that system you see in southwestern Montana is another system that's expected to impact more of the northwestern, and north central U.S. So 2 separate systems, but those are the combined totals for that 7-day period. This is the outlook for the 6 to 10 day outlook. I'm showing this because I just had mentioned how we're in unprecedented cold weather, and the forecast that takes us through the April 28th looks like these below normal temperatures are going to persist. So it'll be interesting to see whether these records that are currently stand across several of these states, whether indeed it does become the coldest April on record. So this forecast is indicating below normal temperatures in those various shades of blue. That's an enhanced likelihood of below normal temperatures. And on the flip side, you can see the western part of the U.S. above normal temperatures. Up in Alaska, where they've been experiencing some above normal temperatures this month, that is expected to continue. On the right, above normal precip, there's hopefully a little bit of pocket of green that we see in New Mexico, Colorado, western Kansas, Oklahoma Panhandle. That's where they need it the worst. So let's hope that we get some verifying of another system perhaps helping to recharge those moisture supplies above and below the ground in that area, because they really need it. Perhaps drier conditions in the browns along the Pacific Northwest going eastward into North Dakota, and then another area from Iowa down much of the Mississippi Delta area into the Florida Panhandle, and then wet above normal precip across the East Coast into New England. This is the El Nino Southern Oscillation forecast. We are currently in a transition phase from a La Nina to it looks like the expectation into a neutral situation as we go through April and on into May. That is favored. The blue bars that you see are the probabilities, and you see those decreasing. And at the same time, the gray bars are a neutral condition, and you see those increasing. And the highest probabilities look like for a neutral condition, and perhaps as we go towards the end of summer, an increase in the likelihood of perhaps an El Nino emerging by the end of summer or early fall. So, but at least for now, it looks like for the next couple months and on into the summer, a neutral condition. That's where the highest probabilities lie. This is a forecast that just came out today, this morning, from the Climate Prediction Center. It's the May temperature and precipitation probabilities. Anything on the left is your temperature forecast. It's encouraging. Hopefully, we will see some warmer conditions with this cold period that we've been seeing, but there is an enhanced likelihood of above normal temperature across pretty much the southern half of the country, and it extends up into the New England area. Highest likelihood are those deeper shades of orange that you see in Southern California and all the way to southern Texas and then parts of southern Florida. But they are indicating still a little bit of cool conditions persisting in Montana and North Dakota, and then a little bit of northwestern South Dakota. On the right, not real encouraging when we look at when we see those browns that are extending from Northern California on into much of the Great Basin into Utah and southwestern Colorado, northwest New Mexico. There is a little bit of an enhanced likelihood of below normal precipitation across those areas. A pocket of above normal precip just to the north in Montana, North Dakota, a little bit of extreme northeast Wyoming and northwest South Dakota, and then equal chances is what the EC is. That there's equal chances for above and below normal precip in the white area, and then as you go eastward, a little bit of an enhanced likelihood of above normal precip, extending from southeast Texas over eastward to Florida, and then north up into much of the East Coast, New England, and the Mid-Atlantic states. So what about the 3-month outlook for May, June, and July? It looks like somewhat of a higher, those warm conditions are going to continue across the southern U.S. on into Alaska, much of on the west coast, on the east. A little bit of a horseshoe of equal chances, that white that you see from Montana to northern Missouri up into the western part of the UP of Michigan, equal chances for above, below, and near normal temperatures. So not strong confidence on what might be happening there. On the right, precipitation over the next 3 months. Alaska, perhaps pretty wet, and then the upper Midwest, extending down to North Carolina, and then covering all of New England for a little bit of a slightly enhanced likelihood of above normal precip. Drier conditions across the Pacific Northwest, much of the Intermountain region. For May, June, and July. This is the summer outlook that also came out this morning. It looks like they deepened that horseshoe of equal chances of above, below, and near normal temperature across much of the north central region. In fact, almost all of it from eastern Montana, catching a little bit of northeastern Colorado through all of Missouri into Tennessee, and then much of the upper Midwest. Above normal, hotter or warmer than normal summertime temperatures across much of the west, south, and east, and then up in Alaska. On the right are precipitation probabilities. For the summer, looks like below normal precip is anticipated perhaps across the northwest. Looks like a tongue of moisture, perhaps the monsoonal impact up into New Mexico, and then South Florida, as well as Michigan and down to North Carolina and into the Northeast and Alaska. So I want to summarize pretty much many of the north central states are experiencing their coldest April on record so far. So that's quite notable, and it's very unusual. I mean, this is kind of focused on that area. I mean, when you think of it globally, we had our fifth warmest March on record across the globe. We saw some much warmer temperatures that have been ongoing in parts of Alaska, parts of Asia and Europe and Australia, but there is this notable area of unusual cold temperatures this month that have been really, the north central region has been the heart of those cold anomalies, and that's been it's been unusual, and it's been somewhat localized when we look at the globe as a whole. The wet conditions across Montana, northern Colorado, blizzard corridor also brought a lot of high snow water content from Colorado to Michigan, as well as wetter conditions across the Ohio River Valley. Of course, the dryness that persists across southern and eastern Colorado, Kansas, southern Nebraska, portions of the Dakotas, northern Minnesota, southern and eastern Iowa, and northern and western Missouri and northwestern Illinois. And then the vegetative growth and field work activity and planting is running behind schedule because of these cold and or wet conditions that have been ongoing during the month of April. Some of the things perhaps to just keep an eye on, of course, the flood potential that is ongoing and perhaps will continue across the upper Missouri Basin. These drought concerns as we go in deeper into the growing season for Colorado, Kansas, southern Nebraska, where some of those deep soil moisture profiles still have not rebounded across southern Nebraska, portions of the Dakotas, southern Iowa, and northern and western Missouri. Of course, delayed planting, we're still running quite behind. And with these wet, cold conditions, across some parts of the area, there could be some disease opportunities and crop emergence issues. For further information, this webinar is recorded, and in past webinars that are reported, they can be. There are a couple links that you can access through the Midwestern Regional Climate Center or the High Plains Regional Climate Center. Other climate resources, of course, the National Centers for Environmental Information, some great information when it comes to monthly climate reports at the state, U.S., and global scale, and NOAA's Climate Prediction Center that provides a lot of awesome resources, including those long-range outlooks that I had just shown earlier. Climate portals through NOAA, the Drought Portal, the National Drought Mitigation Center, the American Association of State Climatologists, and then a great resource for data and charts and maps and all sorts of tools available from the regional climate centers. Those links are provided. And with that, Doug, that concludes my presentation, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. You did an excellent job. You had a little bit more than normal to cover, I would argue, and it's been a busy. Well, it's been busy since the beginning of the year in terms of how the climate is morphing into this, that, and the other thing. So I'm going to get right to the questions since we don't have an incredible amount of time now. The first question comes from Bryce, and Bryce Anderson, and his thoughts, the thoughts on the summer. Could you go back up to let's say the summer outlook, if you will?
June, July, August, right?
Okay. Yeah, let's do that one. Thoughts on the summer shaping up for the region in terms of, well, I'm sure that Bryce, is being an agricultural based guy, but also sort of a meteorologist, climatologist, is interested in our thoughts, and feel free to chime in here, Dennis, on conditions and perhaps things we should be watching out for. I think with this late start, there are people who like to make comparisons based upon what has happened in past years, like, oh, it's been a cold April, it's going to be a hot summer and all that kind of business. But generally, that doesn't work out so well in terms of analog years. However, the real thing on the ground is, as Pat has been saying, crops are way behind in terms of getting planted. Maybe Dennis or Pat, can you talk a little bit about the catching up, if you will, and what it would take to do that, especially in the northern parts of this area, say the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan?
Well, okay, from a catching up standpoint, there's always a concern of delayed planting. Okay, am I going to catch up? What I would tell people is that we've got to wait and see how soon we get in before we start being concerned about that. The catching up only cannot happen during the early part of the summer. Above average temperatures, middle part of the summer don't do much to catch us up in the way of growing degree days. But to morph onto one other thing, what's behind this, we are transitioning, as Pat showed, between La Nina and potential El Nino this winter. So the ENSO condition is not a player. So a large part of what you're seeing here is trend, and there is this noted warming hole over the middle part of the country in the middle part of summer. So that's kind of what's coming into play here. There's a couple other things people are looking at, but by the end of the day, what we're looking at is essentially ENSO and trend are what are going into this situation.
And I'll just add real quickly that it's interesting to note, I think it was the summer outlook last year that came out in May. It's almost identical to what it looks like this year when regard to temperature. And I think, Dennis, that alludes to the trend.
Yeah. That's it.
That's right. All right. I just want to mention that someone asked for the slides, and if you receive an invitation from me, I try to send out an invitation and a reminder every month. But if you're just on the webinar and you're just getting information, if you signed up for the webinar and you're not sort of getting the regional climate information that I send out on, about once or twice a week, you wouldn't see this. Pat, could you go back up to the second slide, please?
The second slide?
Slide number 2, please.
Yeah.
People who want the slides, I'd like them to know or see the URL. Yeah, right there. So if you want the PDF slide deck, they are here. You can see down there a couple different places to go get those. Now, if you want the past recordings, you can go to that lower site. You can hear all of this stuff that we're talking about right now over again if you'd really like to. So you can copy those down if you'd like to get this information. Okay? There's quite a few more questions, so I got to keep going here. Do we know the causes of this cold weather this spring? It's a great question, actually, and actually, it's a scary one for us. So, go ahead, Dennis and Pat.
Oh, thanks. We did struggle a bit with this on our pre-call yesterday. There's something called the Madden-Julian oscillation in the Pacific that I think had part to do with it. There's some issues with a cold pool up over Hudson Bay that's kind of locked in a pattern. Short answer is we don't have and there is a little bit of La Nina influence still because we still are in a La Nina, but there's not one indicator. There's probably a combination of several different things that has locked into this.
Well, one thing is for sure, this year was pegged to be a La Nina winter. Okay, what that generally means is that we have cooler than normal temperatures in the north and warmer than normal temperatures in the south part of the U.S. And for the most part, that is what we saw. And that's not perfect, and I'm not, it's not an exact forecast, right? We also saw wetter conditions in Montana, which is part of that as well, and in the Ohio Valley, which is also part of that classic La Nina pattern. All those things bore out. Now, some of the enhancements that Zenith says come from some other things, some other what we call teleconnections, which cause more cold air, like right now or since April 1st, to spill into the central part of the U.S. and eastern part of the U.S. We won't go into great detail about that because that is a seminar in and of itself. But I wouldn't. Or two or three, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we hope we don't mean to be vague. If there is going to be a study on this, if this turns out to be, a major issue or something like that, sometimes NOAA and or others will do an attribution study to better understand how this happened and sort of why and how often that kind of thing is happening. I got to keep going here. There's interest, and this might be some of our partners on the Missouri River corridor that might want to help answer this one. How about the Missouri Valley flooding from Sioux City? Could you go back to the River Forecast Center of the Missouri Basin, wherever that is?
I think that's the one Kevin provided, right?
Yes, yes.
Kevin Lowe?
Lau, yeah. Kevin Lau, yep.
Sorry.
And the question is about flooding from Sioux City south in northwest Missouri. And this flooding generally is what we're talking about. I think there's a couple things going on here. The Big and Sioux River basins have just gotten a lot of snow. It's relatively wet there. That's not necessarily the Missouri River, but it does flow into the Missouri River, as does the James, and everything upstream. If either Kevins, there's Kevin Stam or Kevin Lau, want to talk, go ahead and raise your hand about this. If I get it right, then you don't need to. But in terms of potential for flooding, I don't think it's any greater than normal on the lower part of the Missouri. There are certain things we all have to watch, and there's certain things we don't know. We certainly don't know, other than maybe the next week or two, if there's going to be very, very heavy flooding or precipitation on any particular place. That can happen anywhere, especially in May and June, right? Those are our wetter months. So we'll have to watch that. Conversely, if we don't get the rain in those months, there are certain parts of this region that get into big trouble, like last year up in the high plains of Montana and North and South Dakota, where the May and June rains simply didn't materialize. So it's a critical time, the next 2 or 3 months, in terms of precipitation, in terms of how fast things warm up, especially with the snowpack and all that kind of stuff. Just about everywhere, actually. Any other comments from anybody?
And the other part about the Missouri River at that point is the Corps does have some ability to regulate if they're able to see flows coming by holding water back in the lower dams. Further down the river, they don't have an ability to do any control that can really do anything there.
Okay. Going down the line here, the question from Ben Diamond is, can the Southern Plains winter wheat crop recover after, let's say the forecast rain does fall? Is there any hope for that? And I think probably a better time to answer that would be next Monday when we do a webinar about the Southern Plains. But since we're talking about Kansas and Colorado, their wheat plantings in that area. Anybody have a
Doug,
Yep.
I got that one too. I looked at a couple graphics that have been sent also by Brad Rippey from USDA Office of the Chief or World Agricultural Outlook Board, and really the tendency is no. You kind of are where you are at this point. There are a couple of years where they do recover somewhat. There's also years where it gets worse. So you know your wheat rating right now is kind of where you are within some relative bounds. So the potential for big improvement is really very, very small.
Say, I'm getting people sort of commenting on what we're saying here since we haven't. So a couple things I want to sort of mention. Nathan Mueller says that there is a winter wheat update meeting for the Central and Southern Plains on Monday at 8:30, led by Oklahoma State University. Listen, Nathan, if you want to provide, if that is a public thing, go ahead and put a URL or something like that or a phone number in there. If it's not, then we'll just wait for the outcome of that. Back to the Missouri River, comment from Kevin Lau from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center is that the Missouri River probably, Missouri River is less than, flooding is probably less than normal for the river itself in that stretch from Sioux City south. Okay, back, let's see, got to go back up here. Lots of things people are interested in. Did the current La Nina strengthen in April to cause these cool temperatures? Actually, Paul Lepesto asked that question. The answer to that is the La Nina actually was in a sort of fading away. Doesn't mean the atmosphere necessarily. So the ocean, basically we're talking about the ocean sort of getting, instead of being cooler than normal, coming back to near normal in terms of temperatures or even a bit above normal. But in terms of the atmosphere reacting to that, if you will, Pacific equatorial ocean, it takes time for the whole globe to sort of come back, if you will, to a neutral or even El Nino or whatever situation. So it is possible that aspects of La Nina still are impacting us today and will into May. June is maybe another story, but it does take time for those things to kind of wear off or adjust. Any comment from Dennis or Pat on that? No. Okay. Any thoughts on the rate of snow melt in the areas of Wyoming and Montana that could impact runoff in the Missouri system? Yeah. So the general rule of thumb out there is that the longer it stays cold, the longer it stays very cold is bad. If it sort of moderates and doesn't get real hot, right? You don't get the fast runoff. You don't get the fast, flash melts or whatever you want to call it. And that can be combined with rain that causes some problems, especially on tributaries. So they, people, I would guess people in the sort of mountain area with elevation and snow and all that stuff like a moderate sort of general melt as opposed to a rapid one in almost every case. And there's lots of reasons they like it that way. The longer we go into the season without melt, especially with places that are above normal in terms of snow, probably you add some risk generally as you move forward in time. Jennifer Carter did send out a link to a recent study. It talks a little bit about the boundary shifts in the next with climate change, 140 miles, moving the 100th meridian 140 miles to the east, causing more dryness and all that kind of stuff. That also is another webinar that we could address. We won't today, but that is for the future. It's not something that has happened already. That is more of a look at what could happen based on some studies. I will say that. And then Virgil Schmidt shares that there are some recent work done by folks at the Iowa State University suggests that yield penalty, and this is probably important for this call, yield penalty, in other words, what you're going to grow for planting corn, into late May is not as great as it used to be with past genetics. So genetics have sort of caught up with, give you a little more flexibility in terms of planting corn at different times of the year. How about the polar vortex weakening to keep the cold in play? Another good question from Bryce. Dennis, you want to deal with that one? That's not fair, Dennis, to just give up like that. Yeah, there is theory about that, Bryce. Again, it's not a proven fact that the polar vortex is more. It's not so much the polar vortex is weak; it's the jet stream that is weakened, thus allowing dips in the polar vortex further south, and also kind of locking in, if you will, certain parts of the northern hemisphere to cold or warm through a long, extended period of time. Again, another great seminar thing. What would cause the cold pool in the Hudson Bay to move so that the storm track moves? That's an easy one. Summertime, but that's kind of a glib, kind of a easy statement to make. Anybody else want to comment on that? That cold pool it's kind of a semi-permanent thing that sets up in the wintertime, and it strengthens and weakens all the time. Sometimes it's strong, sometimes it sends a lot of cold air our way. Sometimes it doesn't, especially during El Nino years, right? Missouri, very dry soil, so tributary inflows are, this is again from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center. Missouri generally has dry soil, so tributary inflows are statistically less than normal. There's not a great concern about the Missouri River itself. Nathan Mueller sent out a nice place to go listen to wheat-related information in the Southern Plains. And it is open to the public. The Arctic was near record warm this winter. That's true. This is from Ted Jamba. And we have a lot of ice missing, or a lot of thin ice that's not going to be around. And let's see. What's this last thing here? Do the northern plains... yeah. So it's a good question whether the Arctic... The record warm Arctic had anything to do with the northern plains. The jury is really out on that. There is a lot of science going on, I think, as we speak, in terms of trying to understand that relationship better.
Yeah, I think, Doug, that word came out, it was the second lowest.
Second lowest, yeah.
Yes, last year being number one.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's all the questions I have at the moment. If anybody else, I have people. Yeah, sorry, Kevin, I couldn't put you on the Kevin Lau. I couldn't put you on the phone because your phone wouldn't work. You didn't put the number in. I can say that to Kevin. He's a friend of mine. Anybody else have any comments or questions? All right. Well, I thank you very much. Next month, we will have Dennis Toddy, who's been ad-libbing sort of with me today until the questions got tough. I'll say that. He'll be the presenter next month in May. The date, what was it again?
17th, I think.
17th of May? Yeah, it's another Thursday. Third Thursday of every month we do this. So we'll know more by then, of course. So thank you all very much, and really appreciate you coming and listening to us and giving us great questions.
Thank you.
And thank you, Pat.